They were stolen from their homes, shackled, and sold to the highest bidder, torn from their families, forced onto ships, and sent to brutal plantations and lands they had never seen. But these weren't African slaves, these were the Irish. For centuries, their story has been buried, their suffering overlooked. Yet, the truth remains, thousands of Irish men, women, and children were enslaved, shipped across the Atlantic, and subjected to unspeakable horrors. Who were the Irish slaves? Why has history forgotten them? And what is the real story behind one of the darkest chapters of colonial rule? This is the untold history of the Irish slaves. Welcome to Old Around the World, where histories are brought to life. The history of Irish slavery is a deeply complex and often controversial subject, intertwined with the broader history of colonialism and forced labor. While some historians debate the distinction between slavery and indentured servitude, there is no doubt that thousands of Irish men, women, and children were forcibly taken from their homeland and sent to the New World. This brutal system emerged in the 17th century, particularly under English rule, when Ireland was subjugated and its people became commodities in an expanding empire. The roots of Irish enslavement trace back to the aftermath of English conquests in Ireland, especially under Oliver Cromwell's military campaigns in the mid-1600s. Cromwell's forces crushed Irish resistance, confiscated vast amounts of land, and sought to depopulate Ireland by forcibly removing its inhabitants. Many Irish were captured and shipped to English colonies in the Caribbean, such as Barbados and Jamaica, where they were sold into forced labor. These people, often referred to as white slaves or indentured servants, endured extreme hardships and brutal treatment similar to African slaves. Unlike voluntary indentured servants from England, who often had legal contracts in the hope of eventual freedom, many Irish captives were enslaved for life. Families were torn apart, and thousands died from disease, malnutrition, and inhumane working conditions. Though often overlooked in mainstream history, the suffering of these Irish men and women is an undeniable part of the brutal legacy of European colonialism. Oliver Cromwell played a crucial role in the large-scale deportation of Irish people to the New World. His invasion of Ireland in 1649 marked one of the bloodiest chapters in Irish history, with entire towns massacred and survivors forced into exile or servitude. His policies not only decimated Ireland's population but also transformed it into a primary source of forced labor for English colonies. Under Cromwell's orders, captured Irish civilians were sold as laborers to plantation owners in the Caribbean. Between 1652 and 1659, an estimated 50,000 Irish men, women, and children were sent to colonies such as Barbados, Montserrat, and St. Kitts. Many of these people were labeled as indentured servants in official records, but their reality was closer to chattel slavery. They were bought, sold, and treated as property, often enduring the same brutal conditions as African slaves. The fate of these Irish exiles was grim. Families were intentionally separated, women and girls were subjected to sexual exploitation, and many were worked to death under the tropical sun. The legacy of Cromwell's policies is still remembered in Ireland as one of the darkest periods in its history, and their effects can still be seen in Caribbean communities where Irish surnames and cultural influences remain. For the Irish who were transported to the Caribbean, life was a relentless struggle for survival. Plantation owners saw them as expendable laborers, forcing them to endure long hours of grueling work under harsh conditions. The humid climate, unfamiliar diseases, and brutal punishments made their existence unbearable, leading many to perish within a few years of arrival. One of the most infamous destinations for Irish slaves was Barbados, which became a major center for sugar production. The island's plantations demanded intense manual labor, and both Irish and African slaves toiled under extreme conditions. The Irish were often given the most dangerous tasks, such as clearing thick jungle land and working in boiling sugar mills, where accidents were common. Even though some Irish laborers were technically indentured servants, their treatment was indistinguishable from that of African slaves. They were whipped, starved, and even executed for attempting to escape. Many historical records describe the brutal methods used by plantation owners to control their workers, reinforcing the notion that Irish servitude was a form of de facto slavery. Over time, the Irish presence in the Caribbean became more pronounced, shaping the region's demographics and culture. Despite their initial status as forced laborers, some Irish managed to gain freedom and integrate into colonial society, though often at the cost of assimilating into the oppressive system that had enslaved them. On the island of Montserrat, the Irish population became so significant that the island was nicknamed the Emerald Isle of the Caribbean. Even today, Montserrat has an Irish heritage that is evident in its traditions, music, and even its annual St. Patrick's Day celebrations. However, this history is complicated by the fact that some freed Irish went on to own slaves themselves, participating in the very system that had once enslaved them. Despite their suffering, the Irish in the Caribbean left a lasting legacy. Their cultural influences can still be seen in local dialects, music, and surnames across islands like Jamaica, St. Kitts, and Barbados. Their story is a testament to resilience, but it also serves as a reminder of the brutal realities of European colonial expansion. The British Empire's exploitation of the Irish was not limited to the Caribbean. Irish slaves and indentured servants were also sent to North America, particularly to Virginia, South Carolina, and New England. The Empire saw Ireland as a source of cheap labor, using both legal and illegal means to transport the Irish overseas. In the American colonies, Irish laborers were subjected to harsh treatment, often working alongside African slaves. While some indentured servants were eventually freed, many remained trapped in cycles of poverty and oppression. The British elite maintained strict control over the Irish population, ensuring that they remained a subjugated and expendable workforce. British policies regarding Irish laborers contributed to deep-seated racial and class divisions in the colonies. The idea of using different groups of laborers to control colonial economies persisted for centuries, influencing later systems of racial segregation and economic exploitation in both America and the Caribbean. Throughout history, oppressed people have resisted their subjugation, and the Irish were no exception. Despite the extreme conditions they faced, many Irish laborers and slaves rebelled against their masters, attempting to escape or fight back against their oppressors. In Barbados, Irish laborers participated in several uprisings alongside African slaves, seeking to overthrow the plantation system. These rebellions were often met with brutal retaliation, with many participants executed or tortured as warnings to others. However, these acts of defiance demonstrated that the Irish, like all enslaved people, were not passive victims but active resistors of injustice. The legacy of these rebellions lived on, influencing future movements for freedom and equality. The shared struggles of Irish and African slaves created unique cultural exchanges that shaped the identity of many Caribbean societies. One of the most tragic aspects of Irish enslavement was the treatment of women and children. In many cases, entire families were forcibly separated, with men sent to one colony and women and children to another. Young girls and women were often subjected to unspeakable abuse, used as domestic laborers, and frequently exploited by plantation owners and overseers. In Barbados and Jamaica, Irish women were sometimes forced into breeding programs, where they were paired with African male slaves to produce mixed-race offspring. These children were then enslaved, contributing to the growing labor force of the colonies. This practice not only dehumanized Irish women but also served as an economic strategy for plantation owners to increase their workforce without purchasing additional slaves. Children, too, suffered greatly. Many were taken from their parents at a young age and sold separately, doomed to a life of hard labor. Without family protection, they were particularly vulnerable to mistreatment, malnutrition, and disease. Historical records reveal that many Irish children sent to the Caribbean died within a few years due to the extreme conditions they faced. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the British colonial system began shifting away from using Irish and other European indentured servants toward a more extensive reliance on African slavery. The transatlantic slave trade proved more profitable, as African slaves were considered stronger, better suited for the harsh climate, and could be enslaved for life with no legal restrictions on their offspring. As African slavery expanded, the demand for Irish laborers declined. Some Irish servants were able to gain their freedom, but many remained trapped in cycles of poverty and oppression. A small number of freed Irish even became slave owners themselves, assimilating into colonial society to avoid returning to destitution. This led to a complex racial hierarchy where former Irish laborers sought to distance themselves from African slaves, despite having shared similar experiences of brutality and forced labor. Though the large-scale transportation of Irish slaves diminished, the scars left by this era remained. The Irish diaspora in the Caribbean and the Americas bore the cultural and emotional weight of generations of suffering, shaping their perspectives on colonialism, resistance, and identity. For centuries, the history of Irish slavery was largely ignored or downplayed. British colonial records often referred to Irish slaves as indentured servants, a term that concealed the brutality they endured. While some indentured servants entered into contracts willingly, many Irish were captured, sold, and treated as property, blurring the distinction between servitude and slavery. The racial dynamics of history also played a role in the erasure of the Irish experience. The horrors of African slavery, which spanned centuries and affected millions, understandably became the central focus of discussions on forced labor. As a result, the suffering of Irish slaves was often overlooked or dismissed as a lesser tragedy. However, both histories are significant and deserve acknowledgement, as they expose the systemic cruelty of European colonialism. Recent research and historical revisionism have begun shedding light on this hidden past. Historians and activists have worked to uncover records, testimonies, and evidence that reveal the full extent of Irish enslavement. While debate continues over terminology, the undeniable reality is that thousands of Irish people were sold, exploited, and subjected to inhumane treatment in the name of economic gain. Today, the legacy of Irish slavery lives on in unexpected ways. In the Caribbean, Irish surnames, customs, and even dialects remain as remnants of a painful yet enduring history. Islands like Montserrat still celebrate their Irish heritage, acknowledging the complex history of their ancestors. St. Patrick's Day, while a joyous occasion, is also a day of remembrance for those who suffered under colonial rule. In Ireland itself, The memory of this dark period has contributed to a deep-seated resistance against oppression. The experiences of Irish slaves and indentured servants played a role in shaping Irish nationalism, fueling later struggles against British rule. The Irish people's historical experiences of forced labor and exile have also fostered a strong sense of solidarity with other oppressed groups worldwide. As more research brings the truth to light, it is crucial to recognize the full scope of colonial history. Remembering the Irish slaves is not about diminishing other histories of suffering, but about ensuring that all voices are heard. Their story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a reminder of the horrors of unchecked power, and a call to never forget the injustices of the past. The story of the Irish slaves is one of pain and survival, of cruelty and resilience. For too long, their voices have been buried beneath the pages of history, but now they speak once more. As we remember their suffering, we honor their strength and ensure that their legacy is never forgotten. The past cannot be changed, but by telling these stories, we shape a future that acknowledges truth, justice, and humanity for all. Please subscribe, like, and share for more of this. Bye, history lover.